Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 1883 Speaker Series. My name is Emma Pierkowski, and I serve as the Distance Student and Leadership Program Manager at the Student Involvement and Parent Programs Office here at UND. Each week, we invite a campus or community leader to talk about how today's student can develop their leadership skills, as well as other advice regarding personal and professional development. We hope you learn some valuable lessons in the next 18 minutes and 83 seconds. For today's speaker, please join me in welcoming the Dean of the School of Medicine and Health Sciences and the Vice President of Health Affairs, Dr. Joshua Wynne.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. It's so good to see you. I'm only going to go over a little bit of information in the next 18 minutes or so. What I'm not going to do is to show any slides. What I'm not going to do is to give a lecture. What I am planning on doing is to tell you a number of stories that have occurred in my professional life that I think have helped shape me in some ways for what I'm doing today. The stories are from the past, and they don't involve UND, but they do involve my prior places where I worked and where I hopefully matured. So if the time allows, I'm going to try to tell 6 stories. Each of them had a significant impact on me, and I'll share with you some of my takeaways from each of these encounters and hope that you may find some usefulness in what has influenced me. In telling these stories, let me just very briefly tell you a little bit about my background so that you can place the stories in the time frame. So I have spent my entire career in academic medicine. I'm a cardiologist by training, and throughout my entire career, ever since I finished training, I've done teaching, scholarship, service, which usually meant taking care of patients, and administration. And one of my challenges has been, how do I divide my time to do all of those, since I enjoy doing all of them? My background is that I did a 6-year undergraduate and medical school degree at Boston University. So 6 years, usually it takes 8 years. Then I did my training in internal medicine and cardiology, interrupted by 2 years in the United States military, where I served as a battalion surgeon in Korea. Following that, I was on the faculty of Harvard Medical School, where I ran the echocardiography, the non-invasive laboratory. Then I was recruited to Wayne State University in Detroit, Michigan, to help build their program. More about that in a little bit. And then in 2004, I came out here with my wife, who is a full-time cardiologist at Sanford in Fargo, and initially was sort of the vice dean at the school, and then after a national search, became the dean in 2010, and I've been the dean since then. So I'd like to tell you some of the stories now in the context of that background. So the first story is when I was what we called then an intern. That is, we now call it a postgraduate year 1 resident. I was out of medical school and learning how to be an internal medicine doctor. And I went to the then Peter Bent Brigham Hospital of Harvard Medical School in Boston, where I was one of 14 interns, or PGY1s. And part of the culture at the Brigham at that time was that you were on call every other night. Now, being on call basically meant that you were up taking care of patients, for the most part, every other night for months at a time. And one evening, this is only the second time I've told this story, but one evening I hit the wall. It was about 10 o'clock at night. There was another patient to see, and I had no more energy. I had hit the wall, and I walked out of the hospital. And for me, taking care of patients was sacrosanct. And here I wasn't up to it, I was walking out. And as I walked down the pathway from the Brigham, I looked up at the coronary care unit, and almost as a sign, the cloudy sky, this was evening, parted and the moon appeared, shining down on the coronary care unit. And I said, I don't know if this is a sign or not, but I'm going back in. And I went back in and felt guilty for having walked out. But in retrospect, I probably shouldn't have felt guilty, but I really was burned out. Now, you might say it's understandable. You were working every other night and so forth, but I was in trouble. I had hit the wall, and I didn't say a word. I toughed it out, and I'm now telling you about it for the second time in my life, and it was a very painful experience. But I did learn from it to the extent to say that nowadays I think we're in a much more accommodating environment for people who are under stress, as I was, to acknowledge it and to seek help. Burnout is real, and I certainly was burned out, but I didn't say a word. And the thing that I think I've learned is it's better to say something rather than to keep it quiet. I'm going to come back to this story right at the end. That was the first story. The second one happened at the Brigham, and this is, again, a little later on, and it deals with organizational culture. Now, the organizational culture at the Brigham was that the medical resident had to know everything about the patient and was responsible. In most settings, most places, it's the attending physician, the real doctor, who is in charge of everything. At the Brigham, for years, they inverted it, that the resident needed to know everything about the patient. So one day, when I was taking care of patients, I discovered that one of the eminent attending physicians had written an order for medication on the patient I was responsible for and hadn't told me or asked me about it. And I went ballistic, quite frankly, because how am I supposed to take care of the patient if I don't know what's going on? So the culture and the practice were different. And I actually talked to the cardiology fellow, and he said, well, let's talk to Dr. Dexter. Now, Dr. Dexter is the doctor who wrote the order and was one of the leaders in cardiology. Almost should have won the Nobel Prize, didn't, but should have, and was an incredibly wonderful teacher. So at 7 o'clock at night, this pipsqueak intern calls up the great Dr. Dexter and said, Dr. Dexter, I'm sorry to bother you, but you wrote an order for so-and-so on this patient. And he said, yes. I said, but you didn't let me know. And he said to me, what he should have said is, why are you bothering me? No. What Lou said was, you're absolutely right. I apologize. It won't happen again. And the moral of the story to me is, here was the culture, not just being words, but being action. That the culture of the organization, making sure that the medical resident really knew what was going on, was endorsed by Dr. Dexter. And I took from that, and I've come up with this expression, but I would urge you to think about it. An organization is not what it says. An organization is what it does. Fast forward, another Dr. Dexter story. Dr. Dexter, who helped invent heart catheterization, where you pass tubes up into the body, came into our coronary care unit having a heart attack. I was not directly taking care of him, but he suffered a complication and basically passed away. They started to do cardiopulmonary resuscitation on him, and through luck or whatever you want to say, the chief of cardiac surgery comes by, sees what's going on, and says, "We're taking him to the OR. I'm going to do bypass surgery." Now, mind you, we don't know where the blockages are, and they're doing cardiopulmonary resuscitation. My reaction was, I love this guy. Why don't you let him just pass away? He's deceased. Why are we doing this to him? Well, to make a long story short, they took him to the OR, did bypass surgery by Dr. Collins just feeling the arteries of the heart, putting some bypasses in, and Dr. Dexter not only survived, but went back to work. By the way, it was true that he had a little cognitive impairment after this episode, and the way I like to say it is, Dr. Dexter, after the bypass surgery, went from a genius IQ down to merely very smart. You could barely tell that he had had this. What was the takeaway that I took from this experience? It was trust your team. Dr. Collins, the chief of cardiac surgery, had the insight to do something that wasn't in the literature, wasn't approved. He just, based on his experience, thought this was the right thing to do, and it was. So trust your teammates. Let's fast forward. I'm now at Wayne State. I am chief of cardiology, and I get a call from the emergency room that there is a VIP who came in with chest pain. So I say, okay, why are you calling me? And they said, you're chief of cardiology and it's a VIP. It's William F. Buckley, Jr. Will you come and see him? Now, some of you may not know, but Mr. Buckley was an icon of the conservative values, wrote a lot about it, very thoughtful guy, extensive writing ability, vocabulary, and so forth. And I said, okay, I'll come over and see him. By the way, let me just point out, what I'm telling you about Mr. Buckley and Dr. Dexter, I'm not violating any confidential information. Both of them wrote about this and published what I'm talking about. So as I'm walking over to see William F. Buckley, Jr., I'm thinking, you know, I'm not sure how I feel about this because I don't agree with all of his political things he's written. How do I handle that when I go in to see him as a doctor and he's the patient? And I'm thinking about it, and I said, I feel awkward, and, he has a great vocabulary, and maybe he'll use a word I don't know. So I'm feeling a little awkward, but they asked me to come over and see him. So I walk into the cubicle where he's lying on the bed, and guess what I find when I say hello? I find a patient. This isn't William F. Buckley, who's on the TV camera and so forth. This is a guy lying in bed who was having chest pain and who is scared. So I immediately relax and I start doing the doctor thing. But in the course of the next day or two, while he's in the hospital, I get to know him. We meet, we chat, and so forth. It turns out it wasn't his heart, and he did fine. He died many years later unrelated to any heart problem. So at least I did my job okay. What I came to learn from this experience is to be careful about prejudging people, particularly in this day and age of political and other polarization. I would urge all of us to suspend a little bit our preconceived notions and wait to see what the real deal is. When I actually met Mr. Buckley and talked to him, I found that we had much more in common than I would have ever guessed, although he never got over the point that he was from Yale and I was from Harvard. But he was very kind and subsequently wrote a column about our interaction, although he did point out that he liked me even though I was from Harvard. But my takeaway from that was to be careful about your preconceived notions when you're dealing with other people, because in many cases they may be true, but not always. Let's go forward now to another event that gets back to the culture issue. So I was here at Harper Hospital in downtown Detroit in Michigan, affiliated with Wayne State University. And my job was to try to increase the number of patients, quite frankly, from the suburbs coming there, and to improve the academic and clinical care that patients would get. And part of this was to make sure that the hospital that was in the inner city was perceived as an outstanding place, which it was, by the way. So I was walking down the hall with the CEO of the hospital. And both of our offices were nearby, and we were walking and talking about something. And as we were walking down the hall, I noticed that there was a big piece of paper just lying there in the hallway, and no one had picked it up. What I would have done ordinarily is to pick up the paper and throw it away. I'll bet most of you would do it too. We wanted to be proud of this place. We didn't want it to look like, run down or anything. And the CEO of the hospital, this is his hospital, walked by the paper and didn't do a thing. Remember what I said before? The culture of an organization is not what it says, but what it does. Whereas Dr. Dexter passed the test, he did in action what he was saying. The CEO didn't. He failed. He said, we want to be proud of this place, but he didn't take the action to follow through on that. Trivial? Yes. Symbolic? Yes. That was part of the problem there, that the talk was better than the action. What really matters, I would say to you, are the actions, not just saying nice words about what you want to do, actually carrying it out and doing it. The final story I'd like to tell you is something that I think we all deal with. The technical term is agency theory, but let me just give you the example, and I think you can think about it in your situation, how it would possibly apply. So remember, I was recruited to Wayne State University with the major goal of building up the cardiology group to to increase the number of patients who wanted to come there to get care. And we did that. We offered outstanding care, we built up the division and so forth, but we were having problems getting patients into the nursing units because there weren't enough nurses. So I went to the head of nursing and I said, or we had a discussion and said, what's the problem here? Why can't we get more nurses so we can staff more beds, so we can accept more patients? And she said to me, I can't hire any more nurses because I'll go over my budget if I do. let me tell you, what the hospital wanted was for her to go over her budget. That is, to have a need for more nurses so that we could take care of more patients, build the reputation of the institution, provide better care, and so forth. But she had been given this narrow definition of what good performance was that was not aligned with the institutional needs. So she was doing her job as far as the nursing budget, but was absolutely doing the wrong thing from the standpoint of the organization. It wasn't her fault, but it was the fault of the organization to not make it clear that, yeah, it's okay for you to go over your budget. We want you to go over your budget because that leads to the success of the organization. So I would urge you to think about it in each of your units where you study or wherever, to make sure that what you're doing within the unit is really supporting what UND is trying to do. And I think UND Leads helps us make sure that we're aligned that way. But it is a problem, again, it's called agency theory, where the local unit may be fulfilling its internal goals, but not the institutional goals. So let me come back now at the end. I'm watching the time, I'm almost there. Let me come back to the first one again, because I have a little more thought about that. And that's the one where I hit the wall, and I urged me and you, if you hit the wall, to not just suffer in silence, but to get some help. But I read a paper last week, this is true, that was in the New England Journal of Medicine, written by Dr. Lisa Rosenbaum, where she talked about what she called moral injury, which is where you're placed in a position where you end up doing something, in my case, walking out, if only for 15 minutes, but walking out, where that was against my principles, but yet I did it because I was overwhelmed by the system. And what Dr. Rosenbaum suggests in this article is, if you're faced with that situation, yes, it's okay to think about your own situation and so forth, but maybe you can do something about the conditions that led to it. In other words, rather than being just, in a sense, the victim, be the protagonist to try to change it. And in fact, at the Brigham, we were lucky enough to be able to do that, because a new chairman of medicine came in not too long after I had my experience, and he said to the 14 interns, okay, ladies and gentlemen, what's the one thing we need to change about the internal medicine residency? And everyone in the room sort of giggled, because even though we never talked about it, the one thing they had to change was the every other night call. So we said, almost in unison, get rid of every other night call. And he said, done. So, if you find yourself in what seems to be an impossible situation where you're tempted, or actually in my case, you do the wrong thing, yes, it's important to acknowledge maybe it's your own failing, but it also may be the context, the construct around you, and it may be possible to change it, as we were able to at the Brigham. So those are 6 stories of experiences that I have had that I think have helped shape me, for better or for worse, hopefully for better, and that I try to live by. You can tell I've gotten a little emotional at times, because these were really transformative experiences I had in some cases. And I think that that if it helped me, maybe it's something for you to think about as you think about your role, institutional roles, and how we work to make us better and institutions better. So thank you so much for attending. I very much appreciate your attention, and I will stick around a little bit to visit. So thank you so much.
Thank you to Dr. Wynne for speaking with us today, and thank you to everyone for joining us. Join us next week as we welcome the Dean of Libraries and Information Resources, Rebecca Bickle, and have a great rest of your week. Thank you.